The airport was busy that morning, filled with the sound of rolling suitcases, coffee machines, and people hurrying toward their gates. Announcements echoed from the speakers, calling passengers to board their flights. Among the crowd was a man named Tom. He had a work trip to Seattle and, like most travelers, he was just trying to get through the morning without any surprises. He stopped near Gate 17, holding a cup of lukewarm coffee and checking his phone. The rain outside tapped softly against the tall windows, blurring the view of the planes waiting on the tarmac. The flight attendants had just called for boarding, and Tom joined the line, half awake and half distracted. He didn't notice much about the people around him, just faces lost in their own worlds. When he reached his seat, 20C, he placed his bag in the overhead bin and sat down with a sigh. The plane smelled faintly of coffee, cleaning spray, and something metallic. He looked around, noticing that the seat beside him, 20D, was still empty. The rest of the cabin slowly filled up. Parents helped their kids with seat belts. Someone struggled to fit a big backpack into the bin, and a flight attendant kept repeating, "Please make sure your mobile phones are in airplane mode." Tom was relieved to have an empty seat next to him, at least for a few minutes. He stretched a little, looked out the window, and thought about the presentation he had to give the next day. Then, just before the doors closed, a woman stepped into the row. She looked to be in her early 30s, wearing a plain jacket and dark jeans. Her hair was tied back in a simple ponytail, and she carried a small duffel bag instead of a roller case. She apologized quietly as she moved past him to sit down. Her voice was calm but low, like someone used to being careful with her words. "No problem," Tom said, giving her room to settle in. She thanked him and placed the duffel bag neatly under the seat in front of her. Something about her movements caught his eye. They were steady, deliberate, almost too controlled for an ordinary traveler. She sat straight, eyes scanning the cabin once before she finally relaxed into her seat. Tom noticed a small tattoo on her wrist, partly hidden by her sleeve. It looked like a symbol, maybe wings or a triangle, but he couldn't make it out completely. He didn't want to stare, so he looked away and opened the in-flight magazine. After a while, the engines roared to life, and the plane began to taxi down the runway. The woman beside him kept her hands folded loosely in her lap, her eyes steady on the seat in front. She didn't flinch when the plane lifted off the ground. Most people around them gripped the armrests, but she stayed calm, breathing evenly, as if she'd done this hundreds of times before. Once they were at cruising altitude, the seatbelt sign went off, and the flight attendants began their usual routine. Tom turned slightly toward her and said, "Rough morning, huh? Airports are getting busier every week." She gave a small smile. "Yeah, seems that way." Her answer was polite but short, so he didn't push for more conversation. Something told him she wasn't the chatty type. Still, there was something curious about her calmness. Most travelers looked tired, bored, or impatient. She looked prepared. About 20 minutes later, the flight attendants came around with drinks. Tom ordered orange juice. The woman beside him asked for just water. Her voice had a certain steadiness to it, soft but confident. When she reached into her jacket pocket to pay, Tom noticed a thin silver bracelet on her wrist engraved with faint letters he couldn't fully read. The plane hummed quietly as passengers settled in. Some watched movies, others scrolled through their phones. The woman in 20D simply looked out the window, her reflection faint against the clouds. Tom glanced at her now and then, wondering what her story was. She didn't seem like a typical business traveler or tourist. The small duffel bag, the scar near her thumb, the tattoo, all little details that didn't quite fit a normal routine flight. After a while, he decided to try again. "Headed to Seattle for work or home?" he asked lightly. She looked at him, her eyes steady but not unkind. "Just visiting someone," she said. "Family?" She hesitated for a second. "Sort of," she replied, then turned her gaze back toward the window. The tone in her voice ended the topic gently but firmly. Tom nodded, pretending to focus on his drink. He wasn't offended. He understood when someone wanted privacy. But his curiosity grew. There was something about her presence that didn't feel ordinary. An hour into the flight, the seatbelt light blinked again. The captain's voice came through, calm but firm. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're expecting some turbulence ahead. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts." A few nervous murmurs spread through the cabin. Tom sighed quietly. He hated turbulence. The woman in 20D reached down to tighten her seatbelt before the announcement even ended. Her expression didn't change. Within minutes, the plane began to shake. The overhead bins rattled and a few gasps came from the passengers. The flight attendants hurried down the aisle, making sure everyone was seated. A baby started crying and the shaking got worse. Tom's heart raced. The plane jolted sharply, and a drink cup spilled from the tray across the aisle. The woman beside him reached out instinctively, grabbing the armrest but staying completely focused. She leaned slightly forward, bracing herself, and said in a calm voice, "It's okay. This kind of turbulence doesn't last long." Her tone was so controlled that Tom found himself breathing a little easier. A loud bang from above made a few people scream. Oxygen masks suddenly dropped from the ceiling. The air felt heavy, thick with panic. Tom fumbled with the mask, his hands shaking. The woman in 20D was already moving. She pulled down her mask, secured it over her face, then helped the woman across the aisle who was struggling to get hers on. "Breathe slowly," she told her, her voice clear even through the mask. A small boy nearby was crying hysterically. His mother was trying to help but couldn't get his strap to fit. Without hesitation, the woman unbuckled, reached over, and helped adjust the child's mask, making sure it fit snugly. She spoke softly to calm him down, her movements fast but sure. "Keep your head down," she told Tom, her tone steady like she'd done this 100 times. He obeyed, without question. Around them, people clutched the seats, praying, crying, or closing their eyes. But she stayed focused, glancing around to check on others. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the shaking started to ease. The captain's voice returned. "We apologize for that, folks. We've cleared the turbulence. Please remain seated until the seatbelt sign is off." The cabin was filled with heavy breathing and nervous laughter. People started looking around, some in tears, others thanking each other. The woman beside Tom removed her mask and sat back, taking a slow, measured breath. Tom turned toward her, still catching his breath. "You handled that like a pro," he said, half laughing in disbelief. She gave a small shrug. "Just stayed calm," she replied, brushing her hands together as if it were nothing. But it wasn't nothing. Everyone around her had noticed how she'd moved, confident, in control, reassuring. Even one of the flight attendants came over to thank her. "Ma'am, you were amazing back there," the attendant said quietly. "Thank you for helping." The woman nodded, almost embarrassed by the praise. "Glad everyone's okay," she said simply. Tom couldn't stop looking at her. "You've done this before, haven't you?" he asked. She gave him a faint, unreadable smile. "Something like that." After that, she went quiet again. The rest of the flight settled into uneasy calm. Passengers tried to relax, but the adrenaline still lingered in the air. The flight attendants served water and snacks to help people settle down. Tom sat there thinking about what had just happened. The way she moved, the confidence in her voice, it didn't feel like luck. It felt like training. Maybe she was in the military once, or a first responder. Something about her composure didn't come from ordinary experience. He wanted to ask, but something held him back. She seemed like someone who carried more than she showed. There was a quiet heaviness behind her calm eyes, like someone who had seen things she didn't want to talk about. As the plane leveled out and the tension eased, the passengers began to smile again. The baby was asleep. The mother finally relaxed, and even the attendants looked relieved. The woman beside him sat quietly, looking out the window. The clouds were glowing softly from the afternoon sun above them. Tom noticed the faint reflection of her face in the glass, calm, thoughtful, almost distant. He wondered what she was thinking about. Maybe nothing at all. Maybe everything. When the seatbelt sign finally went off, people started chatting again, but the cabin still felt different, like everyone had been reminded of how fragile things could be. Tom leaned back, still trying to make sense of it. He glanced at her again. She was sitting straight, eyes on the horizon, hands resting loosely on her lap. There was a small patch on her duffel bag, faded from wear. It looked like part of a name. He could barely make out the letters. Letitia Harper. He frowned slightly, the name stirring something faintly familiar in his memory, but he couldn't place it. Before he could think further, the captain announced they would be starting descent in about an hour. The woman didn't react much, just nodded slightly as if acknowledging the message was for her alone. The cabin was quieter now. The turbulence had passed and the clouds outside looked calm again, glowing orange under the setting sun. People spoke softly, as if not to disturb the fragile peace that had settled in after the chaos. Tom glanced at the woman beside him. She hadn't said a word since everything calmed down. She just sat there, her hands still, her eyes lost somewhere outside the small window. Her reflection looked calm, but there was a tiredness behind it. He wanted to thank her again, but something about her expression stopped him. It wasn't cold, it was distant, like her mind had gone somewhere far away. Maybe she didn't want attention. Maybe she'd been in situations like that before, where staying calm meant survival. He took a sip of water and leaned back, but curiosity kept nudging at him. There was something about her he couldn't ignore. After a few quiet minutes, he said softly, "You really helped everyone back there?" People were panicking. She looked at him, her eyes steady. "It wasn't much," she said. "It was," he insisted. "You knew exactly what to do. You even helped that kid and his mom. That's not something most people would think of doing in that moment." Her lips curved in a faint smile, but it faded quickly. "Old habits," she said quietly. Tom tilted his head. "Old habits?" She hesitated, then looked down at her hands. "I used to have a job where staying calm mattered," she said. That only made him more curious, but he didn't want to push too hard. He could tell she was careful with her words. The kind of person who didn't like talking about herself. "Well," he said after a pause, "whatever you used to do, you were good at it." She gave a small nod, still not meeting his eyes. "I hope so," she murmured. A flight attendant came by, checking on passengers. When she reached their row, she smiled at the woman. "Thank you again for earlier. That was really brave." The woman just smiled politely. "Anyone would have done the same," she replied. Tom noticed how uncomfortable she looked with praise. It was like she wanted the attention to go away. The attendant moved on, and silence returned. He decided to distract himself by flipping through the magazine again, but his mind kept drifting back to her. Something about old habits stuck in his head. She didn't look like a business traveler or a nurse. Her build was lean and strong, her eyes sharp and observant. The duffel bag under the seat had a worn look, as if it had been carried through years of travel. A little later, dinner was served. Most passengers accepted the small trays, though the food didn't look great. The woman beside him declined politely and only asked for water. She pulled a protein bar from her bag and ate quietly. Tom chuckled softly. "Smart choice. These meals are terrible," she smiled briefly. "You get used to bad food after a while." "You sound like someone who's been everywhere," he said. She gave a quiet laugh. "Maybe not everywhere. Just enough to know that comfort isn't something you find easily when you're always moving." That line caught his attention. "Always moving?" he repeated. She didn't answer directly. Instead, she looked back out the window. The sky had turned deep blue and a few stars were starting to appear. "You ever notice how peaceful it looks from up here?" she asked. Tom followed her gaze. "Yeah. Hard to believe how chaotic things feel on the ground when everything looks so calm from this high up." She nodded. "That's why I used to love flying. It gives you distance, a little space to breathe." The way she said it made it sound like she missed that feeling, like she'd once flown not as a passenger but as someone in control of the sky. Before he could ask more, a child's voice broke the quiet. The little boy from earlier was standing in the aisle with his toy plane, giggling. His mother quickly pulled him back, apologizing to nearby passengers. The woman in 20D smiled softly as she watched. "Kids bounce back fast," she said. "Yeah," Tom replied. "I wish adults could do that too." She nodded, still watching the boy. "Sometimes we forget how." Her words lingered in the air. They weren't just small talk. They carried weight, like they came from someone who knew what it meant to lose that kind of resilience. As the flight continued, the cabin lights dimmed. Some people tried to sleep, others watched movies. Tom couldn't sleep. His mind kept circling around the woman beside him. The calm way she handled panic, her quiet answers. That small faded name tag on her bag. He thought about what she'd said earlier. Old habits. Finally, he decided to ask, carefully. "You used to be in the military, didn't you?" For a few seconds, she didn't respond. Then she exhaled slowly. "Something like that," she said. He waited, hoping she'd say more. After a moment, she added, "I flew helicopters. Long time ago." Tom turned toward her, surprised. "You were a pilot?" She nodded. "Army, it feels like another lifetime now." He didn't know what to say. That's incredible, he finally managed. That explains a lot. She glanced at him curious. Like what? Like how you didn't panic earlier, he said. You were calm when everyone else was losing it. You even helped the crew, she smiled faintly. When you've been through worse, a little turbulence doesn't feel so bad. There was no arrogance in her tone, just quiet truth. He studied her for a moment. If you don't mind me asking, why'd you stop flying? Her eyes stayed on the window. The glow of the moon caught the side of her face. Because sometimes the hardest thing isn't leaving the sky, she said softly. It's learning how to live on the ground again. The way she said it made his chest tighten. He could hear a whole story behind those words, something filled with memories, pain, and silence. He didn't ask more. She looked like someone who had spent years trying not to relive the past. The plane hit a small bump, barely noticeable this time, and she didn't even blink. She just rested her head back and closed her eyes for a while. Tom sat there quietly, thinking about her. He realized that while everyone else on this flight might forget her after landing, he wouldn't. There was something deeply human about her, something that spoke of both strength and loss. After a while, the captain's voice came on, announcing that they'd be landing in about 45 minutes. The passengers began to wake up, stretching and gathering their things. The woman beside him opened her eyes and straightened up. Almost there, he said lightly. She nodded. Yeah, feels like a long flight, he smiled. It does, though I guess it was more exciting than I planned. That made her laugh softly, the first genuine laugh he'd heard from her. You could say that. The plane started to descend through thick clouds. The city lights below flickered through breaks in the mist, glowing like tiny stars. The engines hummed steadily, and the cabin filled with the quiet rustle of people preparing to land. Tom turned toward her again. I don't know if this means much, but what you did today, it made a difference. You helped a lot of people stay calm, including me. She looked at him with a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. You're kind to say that, but honestly, I just did what anyone should do. Not everyone would have done it the way you did. She paused, thinking, then said, maybe. But sometimes, when you've seen fear in worse places, helping others through it becomes second nature. That sentence lingered with him. The wheels touched down with a soft thud. The passengers clapped lightly, a habit people have after scary flights. The woman beside him didn't join in. She simply took a slow breath and waited patiently for the seatbelt sign to turn off. As the plane rolled to a stop, she reached under the seat for her duffel bag. Tom noticed the name tag again. This time he could clearly see it. Lieutenant Harper, call sign Echo. Something about that name tugged at his memory. He'd read about a helicopter pilot years ago, someone named Harper who flew into enemy fire to rescue trapped soldiers. The story had made headlines calling her Echo, a hero who never gave up on her crew even after being wounded. He looked at her again. She didn't seem like someone who wanted to be remembered for that. There were no medals, no trace of pride, just quiet dignity. People began to stand, collecting their bags. She remained seated until the aisle cleared a bit. When she finally stood up, she turned to him and said, "It was nice meeting you." "You too," he said. "And thank you again." "For everything." She gave a polite nod, then stepped into the aisle. Her duffel bag hung from her shoulder, her movements graceful but weary. As she walked toward the exit, the light from the cabin window fell across her jacket. For a second, he saw a small embroidered patch on the sleeve, faded but still visible. It showed a pair of wings and the word Echo. Tom watched her go until she disappeared into the line of passengers leaving the plane. He sat there for a long time, staring at the empty seat beside him. Seat 20D didn't look special anymore, but he knew it was, because for a few hours it had been filled by someone who once risked her life for others and now traveled quietly among them, unnoticed, carrying memories heavier than any luggage. Tom stepped out of the plane feeling strangely quiet inside. The flight was over, but his mind kept circling back to the woman from seat 20D. People hurried through the jet bridge, chatting about missed connections and phone signals, but he barely heard them. His thoughts were still caught on her steady voice, the calm way she'd handled chaos, and that small tag on her duffel bag, Lieutenant Harper, call sign Echo. The name played in his head as he walked toward baggage claim. He remembered reading about a helicopter pilot years ago. A woman who flew into a war zone to save soldiers pinned under heavy fire. She had been hit, badly injured, but refused to leave until everyone was safe. The article called her Echo Harper. The story had stayed with him for a long time, but he'd assumed she hadn't survived the injuries, because there were never any updates about her afterward. Now, after that flight, he wasn't so sure. He walked out of the terminal, the cool Seattle air brushing against his face. The rain had stopped, but the streets were wet, glowing under the streetlights. He checked his phone for directions to his hotel, but part of him wished he could turn around and find her again, just to ask if she really was who he thought she was. But she had disappeared into the crowd, blending in like she'd spent her whole life learning to go unnoticed. Tom spent the next day at his meeting, but he couldn't focus. Every time he tried to concentrate, his mind replayed the scene on the plane, the shaking, the fear, and her calm voice saying, "It's okay. This doesn't last long." That night, back in his hotel room, he searched online. It didn't take long to find it. The name Leeton Harper, call sign. Echo brought up an old article from nearly 10 years ago. There was a photo, a younger version of the woman from Seat 20D wearing a helmet and flight gear, standing next to a helicopter. Her eyes were the same. The headline read, "Pilot saves 14 soldiers in night rescue, returns despite being shot down." Tom scrolled through the article. It described how her helicopter had been hit during a rescue mission, but she managed to crash land safely and pull injured soldiers from the wreck under fire. She was decorated with honors and then quietly disappeared from public view after her recovery. No interviews, no social media, nothing, just silence. He leaned back, staring at the screen. The woman beside him on that flight, quiet, polite, avoiding attention, had once been a national hero. And yet she carried herself like someone who didn't want anyone to know. He closed his laptop, feeling both amazed and saddened. It was strange how life worked, how someone could be celebrated one moment and forgotten the next, left to carry invisible memories no one else could understand. The next morning, he left his hotel early. His meeting was done, and he had half a day free before flying home. But he couldn't stop thinking about her. Something in him felt unfinished, like he needed to say thank you again. Not just for the flight, but for everything she'd done long before that. He remembered her saying she was visiting someone near Seattle. That was his only clue. At first, it felt silly to even try finding her. Seattle was big and she could be anywhere. But as he sipped his coffee at a small cafe, he noticed a brochure by the counter. It was for a veterans hospital located not far from the airport. The thought came naturally, almost too naturally. Maybe that's where she was going. He caught a taxi and gave the driver the address. The ride took about 30 minutes, passing through quiet neighborhoods lined with trees just starting to turn orange for fall. When they pulled up to the hospital, it looked peaceful. Low buildings surrounded by gardens, a flag fluttering softly at the entrance. He walked in, unsure what to say. The lobby smelled faintly of disinfectant and fresh flowers. At the front desk, an older woman greeted him kindly. "Hi there, can I help you?" she asked. Tom hesitated. "I'm looking for someone. I think she volunteers here. Her name might be Harper." The woman smiled softly. "Ah, you mean Echo." The name made his heart skip. "Yes," he said quickly. "Echo. She's here most mornings," the woman said. "Usually in the rehab wing. You can check there." He thanked her and followed the signs down a quiet hallway. The sound of soft music and laughter echoed faintly from one of the rooms. When he reached the rehab area, he stopped at the doorway. There she was. She wore a light gray sweatshirt, sleeves rolled up, helping an older man adjust the straps of his prosthetic leg. Her voice was gentle, encouraging him as he tried to stand. "One step at a time," she said. "Don't rush it. Balance first, then move." The man smiled, shaky but determined. "You make it sound easy," he said. She smiled back. "That's the trick, make it sound easy even when it's not." Tom watched quietly for a while. She moved from one person to another, helping them with small exercises, offering quiet words of encouragement. There was no trace of the soldier she once was, no medals, no uniform, just kindness and patience. When she finally noticed him, she looked a little surprised, but not upset. She walked over, wiping her hands on a towel. "You again," she said softly. He smiled awkwardly. "Yeah, I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all," she said. What brings you here? He hesitated. Honestly? Curiosity, I guess. I wasn't sure if it was really you. She looked at him for a moment, then gave a small sigh. I figured you might check, she said. Most people forget faces after a flight. You didn't, I couldn't, he said simply. After everything I read about you. After what you did back then. Her expression softened, but she looked away. That was a long time ago. It still matters, he said gently. You saved lives. You made a difference, she shook her head slightly. You know, people always say that. But the truth is, you never really think about being a hero when you're in it. You just try to do your job and hope you all make it home. He nodded quietly. And did you? Her eyes flickered with something deep. Pain, maybe. Not all of us, she said. There was a long silence. The air between them felt heavy, full of things she didn't want to say out loud. She finally broke the silence. I come here because I can still help in small ways. These people, they remind me that life goes on, even when it hurts. You can't undo the past, but you can keep showing up. Tom looked around the room, veterans talking, laughing, trying to heal. He understood what she meant. He smiled gently. You're still flying in a way, he said. That made her smile, a real one this time. Maybe, she said. Just closer to the ground. They talked for a while longer. She told him she worked there a few days a week, helping with physical therapy and mentoring younger veterans who were struggling to adjust. She didn't tell her full story, and he didn't ask for it. He didn't need to. Her eyes said enough. When he finally stood to leave, he thanked her again. You might not want to hear it, but people like me need to see people like you, he said. You remind us that courage doesn't disappear, it just changes shape. She looked at him thoughtfully, then nodded. Courage isn't what people think, she said. It's not about being fearless. It's about doing what you have to do, even when fear never leaves you. He nodded. That sounds like something worth remembering. As he walked toward the exit, he turned back one last time. She was already helping someone else, holding out her hand for balance, her voice calm and steady. The same voice that had steadied a plane full of strangers the day before. Outside, the sky was bright with soft light. He stood there for a long moment, taking it all in. There was nothing glamorous about the place, no reporters, no cameras. Just a woman quietly rebuilding lives one small act at a time. A hero who didn't want to be called one. That night, back at his hotel, he opened his notebook and began to write. He wasn't sure why, maybe to remember, maybe to make sense of it. He wrote about the flight, the turbulence, her calm voice, and how she'd turned out to be someone far more extraordinary than she appeared. When he finished, he stared at the last line he'd written. Seat 20D didn't look special, but it held someone who once flew into storms far worse than any turbulence, and still came out steady. He closed the notebook quietly and smiled. He didn't know if he'd ever see her again, but he knew one thing for sure. He'd never forget her. When the plane began its descent, the clouds outside had turned golden from the evening sun. The light poured through the small windows, casting a calm glow inside the cabin. Most passengers were quiet now. Some had their eyes closed. Others scrolled lazily through their phones, pretending that the terrifying turbulence hadn't shaken them a few hours earlier. But for Tom, it wasn't just another flight anymore. Every time he looked toward seat 20D, he felt that same quiet curiosity he'd carried since takeoff. The woman beside him sat still, hands folded over her lap, her eyes lost somewhere in the soft hum of the engines. There was something unspoken in her expression, a kind of peace that didn't come easily. The moment felt heavier now that he knew who she might be. The name Echo Harper had been bouncing in his head like a steady heartbeat since he saw that duffel bag tag. He didn't want to ask. He didn't want to intrude. But part of him needed to know. The seatbelt light blinked on with a familiar chime. The captain's calm voice came over the speakers, announcing their approach to Seattle. The woman straightened up slightly, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Tom could feel the words bubbling up inside him before he could stop them. Excuse me, he said gently, almost hesitating. I hope this doesn't sound strange, but were you in the Air Force? She turned her head toward him slowly, her expression unreadable. For a few seconds, she didn't answer. Then she nodded once. A long time ago, she said quietly. Her tone carried both pride and pain, like the words were heavier than they appeared. Tom hesitated, searching for the right thing to say. I thought so, he murmured. You just handled everything so calmly earlier. The turbulence, the people panicking, It was like you knew what to do before anyone else did. A small, almost invisible smile touched her lips. Old habits, she replied. He wanted to leave it at that, but his curiosity wouldn't stop pressing him. The letters on her duffel bag came back to his mind. Your bag, he said carefully. It had a name tag. I saw part of it when you lifted it earlier. It said Latine Harper, call sign Echo. That name, I think I've heard it before. This time she didn't look at him. Her eyes stayed fixed on the seat in front of her, and she took a deep breath before speaking. I figured someone might notice, she said quietly. It's hard to get rid of those old tags. I stopped using that name years ago. Tom leaned back slightly, feeling a mix of awe and disbelief. So it's true? He asked softly. You're Echo Harper? She didn't answer right away. The seconds stretched, the sound of the engines filling the silence between them. Then she finally turned toward him, her eyes clear and calm. I used to be, she said. But not anymore. Tom didn't know what to say. He had read about her years ago. The story of a pilot who had saved an entire squad of soldiers after her helicopter was hit during a rescue mission. She had stayed behind to keep the aircraft steady while others escaped. The report had said she was badly injured and spent months in recovery. Then she disappeared from the public eye. No one knew what happened to her afterward. Seeing her now, sitting quietly in seat 20D, felt unreal. But the way she spoke, the stillness in her voice, made it clear she wasn't looking for recognition or pity. I read about you once, Tom said carefully. They called you a hero. She gave a faint, humorless laugh. They always do, she murmured. But the truth isn't as shiny as the headlines make it sound. He waited, unsure if she would say more. She did. I was just doing my job, she continued softly. That day, everything went wrong. We were supposed to extract a team from a small village. We'd done it a dozen times before. But this time the weather turned bad and there was gunfire coming from everywhere. We got hit hard. I kept the bird steady long enough for everyone else to jump. I thought I'd be fine. Then the fuel tank went. Next thing I remember, I was in a hospital bed and they were calling me a hero on the news. Her eyes glistened faintly, though her voice never wavered. I lost 2 of my crew that day, she said, the ones who didn't make it home. I kept hearing their voices for months. Everyone was thanking me, giving me medals, shaking my hand, but no one knew how heavy those names felt inside my head. Tom's chest tightened. He wanted to comfort her, but he didn't know how. So he just listened. Sometimes, silence was the only kindness that mattered. She looked out the window again, watching the golden light shift over the clouds. After I recovered, I tried to go back, she said. But I couldn't. Every sound, every smell, it brought it all back. I left the service quietly. No big announcement. No farewell speech. I just walked away. Is that why you were traveling today? Tom asked gently, a small nod. I'm going to a veterans center near Seattle, she said. I volunteer there a few days every month. Helps keep me grounded. We talk, we listen, we just show up for each other. That's all most of us need. Someone to show up. Tom smiled softly. That's incredible, he said. She shrugged lightly. It's ordinary, she replied. People think healing is about forgetting. It's not. It's about learning how to carry it differently. Her words lingered in his mind. There was something deeply human about the way she said it. Not like a quote from a movie, but like truth spoken quietly by someone who had lived every word of it. The plane touched down gently on the runway. The passengers applauded half-heartedly, relieved to be back on solid ground. Tom unbuckled his seatbelt but didn't move yet. He didn't want to rush the moment. As the engines slowed and the flight attendants gave their final instructions, she reached for her bag. Tom spoke again, his voice low. You know, you may not see yourself that way, but I think you're still a hero, he said. She paused, looking at him with a quiet kindness. Heroes are just people who do what needs to be done, she said. That's all it ever was. Then she stood, pulling her duffel bag from the overhead bin. The faded name tag caught the light once more. The letters Echo looked worn, almost erased by time, but they were still there. Passengers began filing out. Tom followed behind her, still thinking about everything she had said. When they reached the end of the jet bridge, she stopped to adjust her bag. He wanted to thank her again, but felt words wouldn't do justice. Before she walked away, she turned back to him. Hey, she said softly. Thanks for listening. Most people don't, he nodded, smiling. Anytime, he said. She gave a small wave and disappeared into the moving crowd, her figure blending into the sea of travelers. Tom stood there for a few moments longer, watching her go. The world outside the terminal was busy, people rushing, phones ringing, announcements echoing overhead. Yet in that noise, her quiet strength seemed to stand apart. He finally made his way toward the baggage claim. The flight already felt like something out of a dream. But when he reached into his pocket to check his phone, he noticed something small wedged between the seats of his memory. Not an object, but a feeling. A reminder that even in ordinary places, extraordinary people sit beside us every day, carrying stories the world will never fully know. Later that night, when Tom sat in his hotel room, he searched her name online again. Articles from years ago filled the screen, headlines about her mission, photos of her in uniform, stories of courage. But then he found something else, a small update from a local paper just a few months old. It was about a veteran-run outreach program in Seattle, mentioning a woman named Harper, who helped others find hope after service. The picture was small and blurry, but the same calm eyes stared back at him. He smiled. It was her, still showing up, still carrying the weight, quietly and gracefully. He closed his laptop and sat in silence for a while. The hum of the city outside reminded him of the flight, the quiet after the storm. He realized that not every hero needs applause or medals. Some just need peace. And somewhere in Seattle that night, the woman from seat 20D was probably unpacking her small duffel bag, folding her uniform neatly away, and preparing to meet others who, like her, carried stories too heavy to tell. Maybe she would sit with them, share coffee, listen to their words, and remind them gently that they weren't alone. For Tom, the flight had ended hours ago. But the memory of it, of her calm voice, her honesty, her strength, stayed with him. It made him see things differently. Maybe courage wasn't about facing danger. Maybe it was about learning to live with what came after. As he turned off the lights, he whispered to himself, "Seat 20D didn't look special, but I'll never forget who sat there."